kind of kicked us off, but why don't we get started? Actually, I'm sorry. I think he dropped, but I was gonna say or start by saying thank you to Beth Jacob. Of course, thank you to everyone who's joining tonight, but a special thanks to Beth Jacob just for giving me the opportunity to learn with all of you. Because obviously this is in honor of my grandfather, Leonard Katzin, and it's so nice that so many people on the Zoom knew him and knew him as a fixture of the shul and knew that he sat always in the front row of the balcony. And then, of course, years later, my dad picked up the same tradition and started sitting in the same seat that his father had sat in, front row balcony, right. And then my kids would come and sit with my dad, and it was the same seat that I grew up sitting in. And so, given the 4 generations of our family, that Jacob, it feels nice to give back something to the shul that's done so much for us. And you think about how much changes over the course of 4 generations, but obviously some things, the most important things, have staying power. And so as I raise my own kids, I think a lot about trying to pass on the same passion that my grandfather had for the really important things in life to my children, the way that he passed on to his children and grandchildren. So anyways, this week is the 26th yahrzeit of my grandfather's passing, so let's learn something in his honor. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. Okay, so this shiur is titled Wisdom of Sages, Wisdom of Crowds. And the background is this. In 1841, there was a Scottish journalist his name was Charles Mackey, and he wrote a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And in that book, he chronicled the history of various manias, like stock market bubbles and witch hunts and other forms of mass hysteria. It's amazing, Mackey pointed out, how sometimes large groups of people can go completely bonkers altogether. Okay, so you fast forward to 2004, and actually a best-selling book came out called The Wisdom of Crowds. And that book made the case that under the right circumstances, groups are remarkably intelligent, and they often are smarter than even the smartest individuals within the group. So for example, in our complex modern economy, we don't look to experts to set prices or allocate resources. Instead, we leave it to, quote, the invisible hand of the market to figure out something that's way too complicated for any individual to figure out on their own. And similarly, in a democracy, we let regular voters, just a bunch of regular people, set the direction of the whole country. So sure, crowds don't always get things right. They certainly have the capacity to get things very, very wrong. But even so, crowdsourcing of ideas is often preferable to relying on even the best of experts, okay? Sometimes. Actually, 2 years ago, another book came out. It also became a bestseller, and it was titled, once again, The Madness of Crowds. And that book made an argument about how identity politics is a form of modern day mass hysteria. But I guess the point of the background is Wisdom of Crowds, Madness of Crowds. It seems that for both sides, there's at least one bestseller to be written. And there's probably some truth in both sides. And all this made me think about whether our Jewish tradition has anything to say on this issue, right? Whether there's any embedded meaning or wisdom in the action of groups. Or another way to say it would be whether there's anything to be learned from the behavior of the tzibur, from the behavior of the Jewish crowd. That's what we'll talk about tonight. Now, you might say, this is going to be very short shiur, because Judaism is fundamentally about received wisdom, right? It's the wisdom of the Torah, the wisdom of Chazal, wisdom of the sages. Our job is to educate ourselves about what our tradition tells us, and to educate ourselves about what the halakha is, and then to follow it. So we might be tempted to say that the halakha is what it is, regardless of what any individual or group of individuals might choose to do. And in the simplest sense, that is true. And we could just end the shiur at that. But I think we'll see tonight that it's true with a little asterisk, and it's that asterisk that I want to explore in a little bit more depth. Okay, so to set the context for the shiur tonight, I want to start with a couple of statements from the Rambam that I would say state in the clearest language of any source that I know of this idea that sometimes the halacha is at least impacted by the behavior of lay people, of the tzibur. So let me pull that up and we'll go through it together. Okay, hopefully you can see it. So this comes from, does everyone see?
No, now we see your email. At first we saw the page.
Looks like we are viewing Nellie's screen. Okay, let's try to undo that. Let's see if I can take control. Okay, did that work better? Are we now looking at Rambam?
Yeah.
Sorry, Nellie. Nellie, I don't know how I got control of your screen. I like hacked into your computer. Wow.
Sorry about it.
Anyway, okay. Instead of Nellie's email, let's do a Rambam. So it says, okay. So this is from the beginning of Hilchot Mamrim. The Rambam says, "Beitim hagadol sheb'Yerushalayim hem ikar Torah sheba'al peh." The great Beitim that sat in Jerusalem, what is the, let's just say the fundamental or the foundation of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. Behem amudei hahora'ah, and they are the pillar of teaching. Umehem chok mishpat yotzeh l'chol Yisrael. Okay, so this is the idea that the pillar, the underlying pillar of the halachic system, is that there has to be some finality, some kind of high court that makes the last decision, and from which the final, the highest level teaching comes from the Sanhedrin, at least back in the day when it existed. Alehem hivticha Torah shene'emar al pi haTorah asher yorucha zo mitzvat aseh. And the Rambam says further, and this is not everyone agrees to this, but his opinion is that we are supposed to follow what the rabbis tell us, or specifically what the Sanhedrin tells us, and that is itself a mitzvah daseh to follow what Chazal tell us. V'chol ha'ma'aminin ha'ma'amin b'Moshe Rabbeinu u'b'Torato chayav lismoch ma'aseh hadat alehem ve'lisha'en alehem. And anybody who is faithful must rely on them, the Sanhedrin, let's just say the Sanhedrin. Okay, so that's how Mamrim starts. If you then move to later on, we're going to go to, this is in the middle of the second chapter of Mamrim. Rambam says a very interesting thing, and just as a little bit of background. So the rabbis, or rabbinic courts, or the Sanhedrin, do a number of things, right? They interpret the law, right? They interpret what the Torah and kind of what biblical law tells us to do, but they also legislate and they make rabbinic laws, certain takanot, etc. And so what this is in chapter 2, Rambam's talking about the courts as the legislators of rabbinic law, and there he says something very, very interesting. He says, "Beitin shenir elahen ligzor gzeira o letaken takana o le'amhig minhag." So a beitin that wants to make rabbinic legislation. צריכים להתיישב בדבר ולדעת תחילה אם רוב הציבור יכולים לעמוד בהם או אם אין יכולים לעמוד. They need to look out and decide for themselves whether or not they think the community is capable of following this law that they're thinking about legislating. לעולם אין גוזרים גזירה על הציבור אלא אם כן רוב הציבור יכולים לעמוד בה. And they should only legislate laws that they believe the community can follow. And then he continues on, and he says he says that if they make, I'm not going to read every line, but basically if they make a law and they believe that the entire community would be able to uphold it, and then after they legislate it, they then actually look out, and what they see is that lo pashta berav hakahal. It did not take hold among most of the community. Harezo betela ve'inan rashayim lachof et ha'am lalechet ba. In that case, the whole legislation becomes batel, it becomes void, and they cannot impose it upon the community. And then he says further in the next statement is that if they went ahead and they made a gzera, they made again, like a rabbinic legislation. And then it says that after many years, even ulachar zman merubah, after a long time later, another Beit Din comes along and they see that that legislation no longer takes hold among the majority of Israel. It says yesh lo rashut levatel v'afilu haya pachot mi Beit Din harishon bechokma v'minyan. Then that later court that saw what had changed and that the gzera no longer had hold is actually able to void the legislation, even if they are a lesser court than the court that that first implemented the law. Okay, but then the Rambam makes this last comment, which is important. He says, "Don't get so excited about this idea, or don't be too concerned. Maybe you could say about the idea that some of these laws that an earlier court would have created are going to become voided over time." This is v'chol beit din shehitir shnei dvarim al yemaher le'atir davar shlishi. Any court that went ahead and invalidated two things shouldn't be so fast to invalidate a third. Okay, so in principle, there's this idea that at least laws that the rabbis create need to they're not dependent on the community for their creation, but they are dependent on the community adherence actually for their continued power, but that we should be careful with this idea. Okay, so let me just say a couple of words outside about that. So in the simplest sense, again, this is all kind of like the asterisk. In the simplest sense, we all understand that if you want to know what the halacha is, if you want to know what normative Jewish practice is and what Jewish law requires, if you go and you vote, ask your local rabbi, right? And maybe your local rabbi will then look to a posek, and there's a system of asking to find out what the answer is. In the days of the Sanhedrin, that could have gone all the way up to the top, all the way up to the Beit Din Hagadol Yerushalayim. Okay, but less well understood, I think we all get that. Less well understood, I would say, is the way in which halacha is sometimes shaped by the decisions of lay people. And to be clear, it's the rabbis that determine the law. Lay people have no vote, right? It's not like each person gets a choice on the matter, but we'll see that the halachic system does sometimes call on the rabbis to actually look at what lay people are doing in the real world and to take the common practice of the tzibur into account when they determine what the law is. So let's keep going. Let's go through some of the classical sources on this topic. So here's the next one. This is a famous Gemara from Sachin. So this is the story of Hillel and the Bnei B'Teira. Okay, so let's just go through this one. So it's Tanu Rabbanan, halacha zo nitalma b'Bnei B'Teira. This law, which is what the law that they're talking about, is what do you do if Pesach falls on Shabbat or Erev Pesach, the day that you would shech the Korban Pesach? What if that falls on Shabbat? So it says Pa'am achat chal arba asar liot b'Shabbat. So in that situation, shachu v'lo yadu im Pesach doche et haShabbat im lav. The Bnei B'Teira, who are at that time, let's say the leading figures, says they forgot. They just didn't remember what you're supposed to do if the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbat. Amru, klum yesh adam sheyodea im Pesach doche et haShabbat im lav. They said, is there anyone who knows the answer of what we're supposed to do in this situation, whether or not we should still do the Korban Pesach despite the fact that it's Shabbat or not? Amru lahem, adam echad yesh she'ala miBavel, v'Hillel haBavli shemo. So there is one guy out there who came up from Bavel. His name is Hillel haBavli. Sheshimesh shnei gdolei hador, Shmaya ve'Avtalion. He was a great student of the Shmaya ve'Avtalion, two of the great zugot that are mentioned in Pirkei Avot as kind of the leaders of their generation. V'yodea im Pesach dochet haShabbat imlav. Okay. Shalchu v'karulo. They went to find Hillel. Amrulo. And they asked him the question. Okay, so now it's very interesting. Amar lahem, here's Hillel's answer. V'chi Pesach echad yesh lanu b'shana shedochet haShabbat. Do we only have one Pesach that's doche the Shabbat, that pushes off the laws of Shabbat? V'elo harbe yoter mimatayim psachim yesh lanu b'shana shedochim haShabbat. We have more than 200. Okay, so what's he getting at? He gives a gzeira shava. Okay, that in the same sense as it says b'moado when it comes to Pesach. So in the same sense, it says b'moado when it talks about the korban tamid, which is offered every day. And so in the same sense as the everyday offering is offered even on Shabbat, so too, through this gzeira shava, the same word moado leads us to understand that also when it comes to Pesach, the law must be that we are also do the korban, whether it's Shabbat or not. Then he says, "Ve'od kal v'chomer." And in addition to that style of argument, I'll give you another one. I'll give you a kal v'chomer. Okay, and I'm not going to go through it just in the interest of time. The point is that the Bnei B'Teira forgot the answer. They forgot what you're supposed to do in this case. And Hillel comes along and he basically says, even if you don't know the answer, even if you don't have the received tradition, we can figure it out because we have tools by which, and I'll show you the tools by which we can do it. And it's basically exegesis, right? Or the 13 different categories of rabbinic exegesis, right? So that's that. So then everybody is so impressed. Miyad hashivu berosh. V'minuhu nasi alehem. Immediately they put him at the head and they made him the nasi. And he taught the laws of Pesach all day. And he actually gives them a hard time. He kind of mocks them. He says, you guys forgot this because you were lazy and you didn't do a good job of learning from the great leader Shmaya Vavtali. Okay. So then the next part of this is super interesting, or the story is super interesting. It says Amrullah. Then they came to Hillel and said, Rabbi, shachach v'lo havi sakin me'erev Shabbat mahu. What about the following case? What if we say that even on Shabbat you're supposed to offer the korban Pesach, but what if you forgot to bring your knife? Now you have a new problem. You have a carrying problem. What are you supposed to do in that case? Amar lahen, halacha zo shamati v'shachachti. He says, I heard that. I heard the answer. I know I once learned that law, but I forgot it, which is amazing. Okay, because he had given the Bnei B'Teira such a hard time for themselves forgetting a law. So Ella, but now here's the continuation of what Hillel says, which is super interesting for us. It says Hanach lahen leYisrael. Im ein neviim hem bnei neviim. Says let's leave it to Israel. If they are not prophets, they are the children of prophets. He basically says, let's see what people do. Lamachar misha pischa taleh. The next day, anybody who was coming to sacrifice a lamb, tochavo b'tzamro. They would put the knife in its wool. Misha pischa gedi tochavo ben karnav. And somebody who was going to offer a goat, they would stick the knife between its horns. So basically, the people had a solution. The solution is let the animal carry it. Ra'ah ma'aseh v'nizkar halacha. Hillel saw what they had done, and suddenly he remembered the halacha. And he said, Kach mekublani mipi shmaya v'avtali. He says, oh my gosh, actually what they just did is exactly what I once learned from my teachers, Shmaya v'avtali. And the line for us, so this is amazing, right? Basically, this is a very interesting Gemara where among the many interesting aspects is that Hillel basically says, let's see what the people do. And in this case, it's not their doing it that necessarily sets the halacha, but it turns out that the people do have a certain insight into what the halacha is. Okay. So now I think that idea, let's go a little deeper. That idea that Hanach, what was the line? It was Hanach lehen leYisrael. see what Israel does, see what Bnei Israel do. There are a number of Gemarot that kind of take it a little further. And so let's go through those because I think they're super interesting. So the first is in the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi has one way of saying this. It actually comes up 3 different times in the Yerushalmi, the same phrase that we're going to see in this source. This happens to be in Peah. So it says, Damar Rabbi Abun Beshem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Lo sof davar halachazu. So this saying by Rabbi Abun in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, not only this halacha, and just as background, what they're talking about is they're talking about a specific case. There's a question of, in a specific case, where whether you have to tithe off of certain fruits, okay, whether you have to give maaser off of certain fruits, and they don't know the answer. So he says, not only with respect to this specific halacha, but in general, Ella, kol halacha shehi rofefet bebeit din ve'ein yodea ma tiva, se ure'eh ma tzibur noheg nohog. Okay, he says not only in this case, but as a general matter, when the halacha is unclear in front of Beit Din, and you don't know what the answer is, what you should do, go out and see what the tzibur does, and whatever they do, that's what you should do. And in this case, we see that the people are not mafrish; they don't actually tithe. So the halacha in this case must be, or ought to be, you might say, that we don't tithe. Okay, so there's 3 times that the same idea, the same quote is given as an answer of how do we resolve the law? We look at what people do, and that's the answer in the Yerushalmi. Okay, now again, I don't want to overstate this. The Gemara, whether the Bava Yerushalmi, has hundreds and hundreds of disputes, and they don't resolve the vast majority of them by saying, let's go see what people do. So I don't, again, this is an asterisk. It's not to overstate the point. For the most part, we delve into the matter and we try to figure out what the answer is. But I don't know that it's obvious to everyone that there is this very interesting idea that sometimes the practice of the people does have, it seems, halachic meaning, right? And maybe tips the scales, or maybe is even decisive, depending on the situation. Now let's look in the Bavli, because the Bavli also has a different way of saying the same point. And this also actually, interestingly, comes up 3 times in the Bavli. So it says here, it says Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Borei Nefashot Rabot V'Chesronot. What this is saying is Rabbi Tarfon is they're talking about whether or not you make a different brachot when you drink water, okay? So specifically, do you say Borei Nefashot at the end if you only drunk water? Amar le Rava bar Rav Chanan le'Abaye, v'Amar le Rav Yosef. Okay, here comes the question. Hilchat Tamai, what's the halacha? He responded, Puk chazi mai amidabar. Go see what people are doing. Same concept. Okay, now what's super interesting about this is that it's funny, when I was first thinking about this topic, it seemed to me that what I was expecting, because I'd kind of seen these sources before, but I never thought about it until I kind of looked at it more closely. What I was expecting was that the laws of this idea of when do you look what the community is doing, I expected them to be more in commercial matters. And there it makes a ton of sense, right? When it comes to commercial matters, it would be very easy to say, what's the law with respect to, whatever, how a contract should be worded, or, various commercial related things. You would say, let's go see what people are doing and what they're doing, because it has to do with coordinating people and commerce. That makes a lot of sense that we might say, go see what people are doing. That's the halacha, right? But what's very interesting is that both the Peah case and this case from Brachot, this is about ritual law. It's actually very interesting. So even when you're talking about, should you tithe? Must you tithe? Must you say a certain bracha? Even in that case, which feels like even more like we should be able to figure it out, or it's, anyways, I was at least surprised to find that even in these cases, it seems that that there are times, certain cases, where there's uncertainty about the law, and we may look to common practice as a way of determining what the halacha is. Okay, so those are kind of the classical sources, or at least some of them on the topic. And I should say, the shiur is never going to cover everything. It's a complicated topic, but I want to get at least enough out there that we at least have a language to talk about it and think about it. Okay, so now let's think about some conceptual approaches. Why might it make sense Why might it make any sense to say in certain cases of uncertainty that we look to the tzibur, that we look to common practice to help us decide what the halacha is? I'm going to go through three concepts, three ideas that you might point to. Let's start. Okay, the first one comes from the Rosh. This is actually from a response, from Shalom Chubot. Says, first he quotes the Yerushalmi, "V'chen amrinu b'Yerushalmi b'makom shel achar rafefe be'yadecha halach achar minhag." Paraphrases it. Says in a place where the law is unclear, or has a range of possibilities, follow the minhag. It's interesting. Minhag here is not exactly there's a broader topic of minhag, right, of custom. But just to be clear, that we're using the word minhag here, I think in a slightly different way. Here, we're really talking about what is the halacha, which is a little different than at least what I often think of as minhag, which sometimes is in a narrower sense of you might have minhag, that's very specific of the way that you do it versus the way another, family or community or whatever it is. Often those are in kind of smaller elements of the law. Here, remember, we were talking about do you need a tithe? Things that are more what is the halacha in kind of its in its most real sense. So what is the base ruling? What is, so anyways, he's paraphrasing the Yerushalmi. Then he says perush. So now this is the Rosh topic. Says im yesh refayon b'halacha she'ein barur lecha kami nifsaka halacha. If it's unclear to you what the halacha is, vera'ita shenohagim, and you see how people in fact practice, halach achar haminhag, follow the practice. Why? So this is what we're looking for. Why? Because so far we don't know why, right? The Gemara just said that sometimes we might do this, but it gave no explanation. So here's one potential explanation. The yesh litlot shenir elig dolim shehinhigu haminhag shalacha ken. Okay, so because we may assume or we may surmise that it seems that basically the poskim, the gedolim, the people who created this minhag. First of all, it assumes that the minhag was created by someone, okay? But let's just say, even I'm gonna read it more broadly. Maybe even the gedolim who saw that this minhag existed, right? That they were supportive of it. Okay, so this is kind of the first opinion, is that maybe the reason why common practice has meaning is that maybe it's circumstantial evidence that the poskim must have either instituted it or at the very least been okay with it. And maybe if they had cared enough, if they had viewed it as improper, maybe they would have fought over it. Maybe they would have dislodged this practice. Okay, so this is this circumstantial evidence kind of argument. And then he made clear at the end, he says, aval b'makom she'ein refayom b'halacha. But in a place where there is no uncertainty with respect to the law, ein lecha lelech achar minhag shehu keneged halacha. He says, of course, you don't follow the tzibur if they're breaking halacha. So if there's not uncertainty about the law, we don't follow the common practice. But again, in a case of uncertainty with respect to the law, where you see that a common practice has emerged, maybe that is evidence that actually it has rabbinic sanction. Okay, so that's kind of possibility number one. Okay, here's a quote, a very interesting quote from Rav Eliyahu Bakshi Doron, a former Sephardic chief rabbi. And he gives, we're going to see two different reasons that he gives in just a few lines. So the Biur Hadvarim, an explanation of these words. Kivan she'am Yisrael munacha v'hashgacha elyona. Says because Am Yisrael has, God's looking down and making sure that the things go okay. Okay, so God is looking out for us. Shakadosh Baruch Hu raglei chasidav yishmor umenache otam b'derech haemet. So this is kind of in a poetic way saying, I'm gonna paraphrase what he's saying. He's saying this in a somewhat poetic way, that Hashem's looking out for us and wouldn't allow a minhag to take hold were it a mistaken minhag. almost like a metaphysical kind of explanation, that if you see that the tzibur has taken on a certain practice, then maybe it's circumstantial evidence that maybe God is behind it. Maybe this is actually that God would not allow the well-intentioned masses to sin. Okay, but then he says, I think he says kind of the same thing in maybe less metaphysical terms. He says, "Ve'im lo betzivui mefurash kenevi," and even if what they're doing is not by an explicit command, as through prophecy, b'nei nevi'im hem. Now remember what he's referring to what Hillel had said. Remember, Hillel said, "Let Bnei Israel do what they're going to do. If they're not the prophets, they are children of prophets." Okay, so playing off that line, he says, "Shechochmatam omedet lahem linhog halacha," that their wisdom pushes them to behave according to the halacha in a way that isn't prophecy per se, but is almost like me'ain prophecy. It's almost like derivative of prophecy. That he's like expanding on this line of Hillel's, that if they're not, if Bnei Israel as a whole, as a tzibur, are not prophets, they're, and here I love that he used shechochmatam, and this is the first place where you get this inkling of maybe the wisdom of the tzibur, the wisdom of that crowd is almost prophetic. And you might say that what that means is that it embodies a wisdom that's greater than any individual's insight, which is again kind of me'ain nevuah. It's like an idea of, it's not quite prophecy, but it is the coming to view of an idea that's maybe deeper than any individual would have come up with on their own. Okay, so it's a poetic way of saying, I think, something like wisdom of crowds. Okay, so let's I think it's clear, but I just want to take stock. And again, there are many more sources that you can go through on this matter, but the goal here is not to be exhaustive, but to raise what I think is this very interesting issue of this tension between the baseline is that the law is the law, the halacha is there to mold us, right? And then on the other hand, as this little asterisk, there are times when the halacha is just unclear, and we do our best to figure it out. And one of the tools that the halachic system builds in is that as the rabbis, as the poskim are making their decisions, they should look at what the tzibur is doing to help them to decide what the rule ought to be. Okay, so now that's kind of all part one. That's intro. The second part of the shiur, I just want to go through an example, because this has all been theoretical so far. So I just want to go through an example. And the idea here is not to decide I'm not going to go into depth at a level of like what the halacha is, but more like how would this idea of looking at the tzibur even be applied in the real world? Okay, so we're going to look at a real world example. And this is actually part of when I started thinking about this topic. It was on Sukkot. Okay, so let's talk about a sukkah. So, okay, so we start with Amazon, most important source. We start with Amazon. So it says here, you can go online for $709. You can get a 10 by 15 prefab sukkah. And it says easy to build, sukkah, however you spell it. And then here it says certified kosher. Okay, so I looked at that and I just thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. Kosher with respect to what? Now we know that a sukkah, any kid that has learned, either the Mishnayot of sukkah or like any of the laws of sukkah, we understand that there are laws of sukkah. But I just kind of was thinking a little bit more, okay, certified kosher with respect to what? And the reason, it sounds silly, but the reason that I thought that was an interesting question is that we're so used to seeing prefab sukkot everywhere that I will put myself in this category. We don't think about all of the details. Maybe we should, that stand behind deciding whether or not a prefab sukkah is kosher. And it turns out that there are actually a bunch of halachic issues that have to be overcome before you can feel comfortable that a prefab sukkah is actually kosher. And so we're going to go through some of them. Okay, so let's start. So let's start with the walls. So this is a big topic. So prefab sukkahs, the first issue that you have to get over for them to be kosher is an idea about whether or not basically canvas walls can be kosher. And the source that you would look to that creates the controversy, or you would look to in the Shulchan Aruch is this statement. I'm just going to run through this in English in the interest of time. It says, if one makes a sukkah between trees, with trees as its walls, if they're strong or tied and secured such that a normal wind will not regularly shake them. So basically, there are Gemaras that stand behind this, saying that if you're going to use trees as the walls of your sukkah, they have to be sturdy, they have to be tied down. They can't be swaying in the wind, swaying in a normal wind. Okay. And it says even if the open spaces need to be filled with straw. So basically, if they're sturdy, it's kosher. But here's the kicker. It says, therefore, it is not good to make the walls from sheets of flax without poles, even if they are tied well, because sometimes they unintentionally get detached, and you'll have a wall that cannot withstand a normal wind. The Shulchan Aruch basically says you should not make a sukkah out of flax sheets, basically fabric, that don't have poles, and we'll get into later what that means. So don't use fabric sheets as your walls, even if they are tied well, because maybe they'll become untied and they'll flap around. And then he says, if one wants to use sheets, it's good to weave poles into the walls every 3 tfachim. So there's a solution that because the sheets themselves are not good walls, what you could do is you could have something, and then 3 tfachim later, something else, let's say a stick, and 3 tfachim, because every 3 tfachim are, from a halachic perspective, they merge, it's as if you've created a wall, right? But the point is that that's the way that you make it work, because the fabric wall is not a good wall. Okay? Now, I don't know the history of this, and maybe this was never a controversial issue, but certainly in our times, when the prefab sukkot started to become a very commonplace thing, and of course, it's not that long ago. I mean, I remember as a kid, there were no prefab sukkot, at least none that I'd ever seen, and then suddenly they were everywhere. So at that point, this became a much more real issue. And it's actually more controversial than you might realize. So there are a range of views among different poskim, but some of the highest profile ones have actually came out against using fabric walls. So for example, Avodah Yosef has a tshuva that does not look kindly. Basically quotes this line from the Shulchan Aruch and says that even if you tie down the ends in a firm way, we're concerned that the ties will become loosened, right? And similarly, Rosh Zalman Auerbach, has a statement that basically if you use plastic curtains that sway even a little bit in the wind, then that would be unfit. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva that actually interestingly says that we should not misinterpret the prevalence of these canvas sukkot as an endorsement of their validity. Okay. I'm going through all of this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way trying to cast aspersions on prefab sukkot in any way. And it's not to say that that just because you can point to certain opinions that were were not supportive of using canvas walls, doesn't mean that's the halacha, or that's kind of what has come to be the halacha. Okay, but and again, the general disclaimer that this is not a practical shiur in any way, right? But I think what is interesting to point out is that this is one of a million. There's so many examples like this. You don't have to look too far to find a disconnect between, so in this case, how commonplace these prefab sukkot have become. So much so that we don't even think about whether there are halacha or halachic issues at play, right? And so that kind of their commonplaceness, and on the other hand, the stature of some poskim that would question their kashrut. Again, it doesn't. So that's the setup. I just think that's an interesting general setup. And So to broaden it, at the level of text only, or at the level of sources, you could easily make the case that this would not be allowed. Okay, and certainly we've seen that there were some poskim who took that opinion. But as we look around in practice, the widespread use of prefab sukkot is just evident, and it's not clear that everyone is as worried as they might be about, like when they put these up, the tautness of their canvas walls, right? So okay, so that's kind of one topic of prefab sukkot. Again, not to cast aspersions on them, but just to highlight that there's more kind of halachic material on the topic than you might at first realize. Okay, the second one, which is also super interesting, I think, is bamboo mat tzchach. And this one, I would say, even has been more clearly, the issues have been resolved. But it's worth just being aware that, there were halachic issues that had to be thought through. And that also starts with a certain line from the Shulchan Aruch. So there it says, regarding a mat made of reeds, straw, papyrus, or bulrush, whether or not the mat is smooth and lies, and thus fit to lie on, or not smooth and not fit to lie on. Actually, this first part, let me just paraphrase. So basically, this is saying, back in the days of Rav Yosef Karo, they also had bamboo mats. Okay, and also back in the times of the Gemara already talks about what about mats, not specifically bamboo, but mats of reeds. Says in that case, it matters whether or not what the purpose of mats in general are. Okay. And I think the reason, just to give one more piece of background, which is useful, just to remind ourselves, is that tzchach, right? Tzchach has to have, there are three requirements. One, it has to grow from the ground. Basically, it has to be vegetation, right? Two, it has to be separated from the ground. It can't be living. It can't be a living vegetation. But third, this is what's most important for us, is it can't be something that can be mekabel tuma. It's not something that's capable of becoming tameh. And what that means is that it's not a vessel, meaning it's not something that's been altered or processed in a way that it's not natural anymore. It might be a product with natural, that's made of natural things, but is no longer natural. It's now a man-made product. Okay, so with that as a background, if it's something that's a mat that seems like the kind of mat that you would use for lying down on, hanging around in your house in a society where you sit on the floor, or sleeping on, then it's more likely that the mat is like a product. It's more like a mattress. And but in a place where that's not the case, then it's more likely that we would look at this thing and say, no, it's just a bunch of reeds that are tied together. Okay, so sorry if that's a little technical, but the point is this, let's get to the punchline. If it's large, so if it's a large mat of reeds, it's presumably intended to be schach and maybe used for schach, unless it was made for lying on, meaning that the local practice is to lie on. So actually, it actually matters how people will view mats of this type. If in general they are viewed as a product, more like a mattress, then you cannot use them as your schach. If on the other hand, it's clear that what this thing is schach, then it works as schach. Okay, so with that as background, so this is kind of interesting. This is from the OK website. So this is kind of the modern application. It says the schach certified by the OK is made from bamboo mats. The mats that we certify are made in China. Today in China, mats are usually made for shades and not for sitting on. Okay, so that's right, because the sitting on is like that's the Gemara's case. That's the Shulchan Aruch's case. Okay. In addition, while visiting the factory, I had the owner write up a sign in Chinese to be hung up in the factory, stating that the mats being produced now are made for shade and religious purposes. To ensure that the sign stated exactly what I requested, I took a copy of the sign and showed it to various Chinese-speaking people, from the hotel personnel to airline passengers, on the plane ride back from the facility, and asked them to please translate the sign. It was indeed written as I requested. Okay, Now, note, in Kenya, these mats are made for use as roofing year-round, which would be a problem to use them as schach. Okay, well, super interesting. So this is the application of exactly the set of issues raised that we saw in the Shulchan Aruch. And then he goes on to deal with another potential issue related to bamboo mats, and basically the cotton string. Again, in the interest of time, I don't want to go through that in detail. It's another potential issue, which has been, which basically you would say lamaisa, it has become common practice to view this not as an issue. Okay, and then he says if you're still not comfortable with the string, then you should put X-shaped supports. Okay, again, in the week, beyond what we're going to cover today. But I think the last line is very interesting. Here's the last line. The bamboo mats certified by the OK have enabled thousands of Jews to have easy-to-use kosher schach for their sukkahs. Rabbanim and Jews all over the world use the bamboo mats to cover their sukkahs, in remembrance of the way that Hashem covered the Jews with the clouds of glory as they wandered through the desert. I think this line is super interesting because everything to date has been like in the technical realm of more like the arguments that you might make back and forth about, is this kosher? But the last line, I think, gets at a little bit what we're talking about tonight, which is to say, and by the way, lots of Rabbanim and real people use this, right? So, and that's a little bit what we're getting at, right? So stepping back from the weeds, actually, let me stop sharing. Just screen. Okay. So stepping back from the weeds. We're so used to seeing, again, this is just one specific example. We're so used to seeing prefab sukkot that we don't even think about a range of halachic issues and potential controversies that surround them. We saw that many of the poskim had different issues that could have made these more problematic. Okay, there's a range of potential issues related to the walls and the schach. But the consensus seems to have been that the schach, the bamboo mat schach, is not a problem. And with respect to the walls, maybe depending on who you follow. Okay, but all of that is, I think, at somewhat of a disconnect, at least in our community, of where, if all you did was read the halachic literature, you might come away wondering how in the world it is that we all use prefab sukkot, or at least how it came to be that they're everywhere. And yet they clearly are, okay? And so you might ask, is this a case of the wisdom of crowds or the madness of crowds? And it's kind of neat that actually Rav Moshe Feinstein in his tshuva actually said, don't mistake the fact that everybody uses these for that being the answer. Yet we also saw that in some set of situations, we do look to the crowd in hard cases, and we do look to the tzibur to see what they do. So that's basically the issue of this shiur that I'm trying to drive home, is this hard question of to what extent do the facts on the ground matter at all from a halachic point of view, right? And we saw, to restate, that there were multiple different explanations of why it could matter, okay? In a case where the halacha is unclear, it may be that we look to the communal practice as circumstantial evidence of what the rabbinic community must be okay with, or maybe even more than, right, either that they were behind or at least were okay with, and it's circumstantial evidence of that, right? Or maybe it's something different. Maybe it's that there's actually some wisdom in what people do and that we're meant to look at that and take something away, okay? Now that second one is a little harder. It's not the way we usually think about a halachic question. So this is the last piece of the shiur, is just to look at, in the case of, again, kind of following through on this case of sukkah, let's just think about, let's play it out. How might you even think about this idea of a wisdom of crowds when it comes, or a wisdom of the tzibur, when it comes to this issue of a prefab, controversies with respect to a prefab sukkah? Okay, why would that make any sense for us to look to the behavior of the tzibur? Okay, so there's one last thing. So to do that, I'm going to share one last time. Okay, so let's just go through to remind ourselves the first Mishnah in Sukkah. So it says, so this is how the Masechet starts. Sukkah shehi gavoa l'mala me'esrim amot psula. If a sukkah is too tall, above 20 amot, it's pasul. Rabbi Yehuda Malshir, not according to Rabbi Yehuda. The she'ena gavoa asarat tvachim. If it's too small, or not high enough, I should say. The she'en la shlosha fanot, or it doesn't have 3 walls. The shechamata merubah mitzilata, or it doesn't have, or if it has too much sunlight coming through relative to the amount of shade, psula. In those cases, it's pasul. Okay, so that's how the Mishnah starts in Sukkah. And the rabbis will then, in the Mishnah and the Gemara, will spend the next couple of chapters going through way more detail. Actually, let me share. We'll go through way more detail to just look at all of the edge cases of which sukkah is kasher, which is pasul. Okay, but at the core, these different cases, their resolution depends on a very basic idea, which is the fundamental question is, what makes a sukkah appropriately impermanent? Appropriately impermanent. On the one hand, it shouldn't be too permanent, because the whole point is that we're sitting in a sukkah, right? We need to be reminded of a temporary existence in the desert. It's too permanent. If you don't have schach, if you've got a roof above your head, it's not a sukkah, clearly. On the other hand, a sukkah, so it can't be too permanent. On the other hand, a sukkah has to be substantial enough. It has to have enough walls, provide enough shade, because that also, it has to capture the idea that we're thankful for how God protected us in the desert. If you have a shabby, flimsy sukkah, then it's not a good sukkah either. It has to be appropriately impermanent, okay? So the Gemara and the Mishnah will go through a ton of cases. What if you use a tree as a wall? What if you use an animal as a wall? What if it's only big enough for your head and most of your body to fit, but not your table? There are a ton of these cases that it goes through. And similarly, as cases come up today, we try to figure out a resolution. What if you have canvas walls? What if you have a mat that is from Kenya? There are a million cases, right? And we try to figure out, what do we do in each of those cases? But what's interesting about sukkah is that, and this is the kicker, is that I think some of these questions, this question of appropriately impermanent, is something that regular people might actually have a view on, something to contribute to the question. And it's because of this. Regular people have some insight into questions like, does a manufactured bamboo mat seem temporary enough that when we sit in it, we don't confuse it with a roof? Does it feel to us like schach? Does it actually remind us when we look at it of the fact that Hashem took care of us in the desert? Okay, the canvas walls feel like a dwelling place. Does a sukkah with canvas walls feel like a dwelling place? Or does it feel like a flimsy shack? Does it feel like something that would just get blown away in the wind? Okay, of course there's a shiur of what that the Gemara talks about, and it comes through of what does that mean? What is too flimsy? Okay, but the point a little bit is that when you sit in a sukkah something about whether or not the impact of being in it gives you the experience of sukkah. And it turns out that people actually vote with their feet to some extent, right? And so anyway, I'll be interested. I don't know if everyone will agree, but I think that these are some things where people have something to say, something to weigh in on, whether or not well-reinforced walls of a prefab sukkah feels to them like a sukkah, whether or not a bamboo mat above them feels like schach. Actually, the behavior of the tzibur may be something worth taking into account when the poskim are thinking about whether or not these are good or not, whether they're kosher or not. Of course, for practical guidance, ask your local rabbi, but at least in concept. Okay, so I think this is what we'll leave off with to sum it up. Okay, so number one, Judaism is not a democracy by any stretch. You don't get a vote in what the halacha is, and the law is actually not designed to cater to you. Maybe the opposite, right? Or quite the opposite. The law is designed to mold who you are. So the idea is not that people get to do what they want, okay? But as we've seen tonight, the actions of the tzibur do have an impact sometimes on the halacha. And there is something within the halachic system that's meant to say that when the law is unclear, common practice can tip the scales at least one way or the other. As the Yerushalmi says, Re'eh ma hatzibur noheg v'nehog. See what the community is doing and do it. The Bavli puts it, Puk chazi ma amadabar. Go see what people are doing. And we saw that there are multiple rationales about why this might make sense. Maybe the community practice is circumstantial evidence of rabbinic support, or at least acceptance. Maybe there's a metaphysical explanation that Hashem is looking out for us and that this is some sign that we couldn't have gone too far astray. But that one to me seems the hardest to understand, but anyways, it is an idea that's offered. Or maybe we might say, and this is kind of this wisdom of crowds idea, that there's a certain wisdom of the tzibur that acts as a kind of, actually amazingly as a kind of prophecy, as a way of getting across wisdom that's beyond the intellect of any individual. So in Hillel's words, leave it to the Jewish people. If they're not prophets, they're sons of prophets. And I think that's an interesting and kind of inspiring idea for us all to think about. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed. And I hope this is really something that that my grandfather would look down on.